Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for the video cast today. Today we're looking at the continuity and change that is represented in the eastern part of what had been the Roman Empire, which will become known as the Byzantine Empire. And when we get started, let's go back a little bit to the classical period. You might remember that late in the Roman Empire, the empire is getting too big. Diocletian decides to split the empire into two. One is centered on the city of Rome, the Western Empire, the Eastern Empire, a city that at the time was called Byzantium. And then when Constantine converts to Christianity, he renames the city of Byzantium Constantinople, which literally means the city of Constantine. And from that point on, the eastern part of the empire is doing pretty well, even as the western part is really, really collapsing. And due to the pressure from the Germanic migrations and internal problems, the city of Rome itself finally falls in 476. But the Eastern Empire never stops. In fact, for a while, they call themselves Romania because they are, in their minds, quite literally still Rome. But in contrast to what's going to happen in Western Europe, their society becomes much more urbanized, focused on big cities, obviously Constantinople, the main one. And the style and the affect of the ruling elite becomes more and more seen as different from Western Europe. In fact, they use the term Oriental to describe the style that they see that contrasts with the sort of Germanic values of the Western Empire. That's kind of typified in this really famous mosaic, all of these different tiles. The color is a little bit off on here. What looks like it's brown is actually purple. But what you see is the emperor in the center. To our right is the bishop of Constantinople and other church officials. To the left, to our left, is the administrators and the soldiers. But what you see out of this from the perspective of Western Europeans at the time is something that looks much more Oriental to them as opposed to Occidental, which they think of as their way of life. But the transition from Rome to Byzantium really sort of starts to come together under this dude, Justinian, who will serve as the emperor for almost 40 years. An interesting thing about his biography, though, is he was not originally from an aristocratic family. He was kind of unknown guy, but he was apparently really smart. He was trained to become a bureaucrat. He worked his way up the government to the highest levels, and then through all sorts of political intrigue and possibly murder, he's able to put himself in position to become the emperor. But once he becomes the emperor, his sole focus, his vision is to make Rome great again. He wants to bring back the glory days of the Roman Empire. To do that, he's got to raise taxes, though. And that turns out to be quite contentious. But his wife, who also has a very interesting backstory, Theodora, it turns out is really, really shrewd politically. And she serves as a very active advisor in his reign. The earliest test, though, of whether or not he's going to succeed is something called the Nika riots. And in the eastern part of the empire, the gladiator games were not such a big deal. Instead, they focused on chariot races. And there was a stadium called the Hippodrome that was built to host these races. And the teams were associated with colors. And the people who supported their teams, like if you know anything about like soccer in Europe and the fanaticism of the supporters of the various teams, clearly it kind of has its roots in what is going on here. Specifically, two teams who hated each other dramatically, the Blues and the Greens. After one particularly contentious race, though, a riot breaks out, but the frustration, the anger among the common people is really about the increase in the taxes. So while they start fighting each other, they kind of realize, well, this is not our fault, they literally leave the hippodrome and just start burning the city down in these unbelievable riots. Justinian, incidentally, thinks he should flee the city. He's worried that his safety is under threat. And it's Theodora who says, no, if you leave now, then you have lost all legitimacy. So instead, she suggests sending in a general named Belisarius. And Belisarius was not just a military genius, he was a political genius. And he's able to sort of work and negotiate with the blues and the greens and using all sorts of tactics to eventually calm everybody down and end the riots. The riots being um, solved, then Justinian now puts his plan into effect to make Rome great again. One of the first things he does is build a new city, starting with the Hagia Sophia, which you'll remember was a church, a Christian church originally. This is an image of it now, and obviously the 4 minarets you see on each corner having been added after it was converted to a mosque. But another thing he does is he creates a new legal code, but he creates it by condensing and sort of summarizing all the different Roman laws that had existed before him. This is known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. Romans always believed that good laws were what would keep the empire together, but they had written so many laws in so many of their different provinces that it was kind of overwhelming. And so what Justinian does is tries to bring all of this together and summarize it. Now, that's obviously an awful lot of stuff there, but if you can imagine what it was before he's able to bring it together, it was pretty overwhelming. Third thing he does, though, is he sends Belisarius out on another mission, and that mission is to reconquer the territory of what had been Rome. And Justinian really envisions like he's going to make the one giant Roman empire again. And Belisarius, being the military genius that he is, he's able to reconquer a whole lot of the lost territory. In fact, within a few decades after Justinian, in this image, Rome, the Byzantine Empire, as it's called at that time now, it starts to look very much like what the old Roman Empire looked like. It's included part of North Africa, the Levant, parts of the Italian peninsula. It's not quite so big, but it appears that they are moving in the right direction. You will notice to the right in orange there, the Sassanid Empire. This is the last of the Persian dynasties, is sort of existing side by side with the Byzantine Empire. But if you look at the date around 600 CE, something is about to happen that's going to change everything, and that something is Islam. And if you look at this map, what you see in the dark blue, the conquests of Muhammad during his lifetime, then the light blue, the Rashidun, the 4 rightly guided caliphs afterwards, are able to conquer most of the Sassanids and a big chunk of the Byzantine Empire and extend all the way across North Africa and into Spain. So what is happening is after that brief moment where it looks like Byzantium is going to sort of reinstate the glory of the one giant Roman Empire, it quickly shrinks and it's surrounded by Islam on many, many sides. And it's going to stay in that sort of smaller condition under threat for centuries. And as a consequence, a new type of government system evolves called the theme system. Now, here's the thing about the themes. They're kind of like the old Roman provinces, except that they are run by a general. They are a military unit primarily because they are constantly under threat from Muslim attacks. Now, the generals who are in charge, as opposed to governors, the general's job is to recruit locals to build both an army and also a bureaucracy. And so the general is always looking around the countryside for young men who show some sort of promise, either intellectually or physically. and then has to train them and build the systems to put them into government positions as bureaucrats or as soldiers. Now, in exchange, the families of those boys who he has to recruit are given land in exchange. Okay. And initially, this has a really positive social effect, right? A lot of these peasant families who really couldn't afford anything are now given land because their sons are being recruited by the state. Another consequence is because those boys have to be trained, public education actually becomes a thing, and literacy expands. But over time, within the span of a few generations, really, what happens is those peasant families can not afford to hang on to that land, and so they sell it to wealthy landowners, and then they are sharecroppers. Basically, they're allowed to use the land, but the largest percentage of the crops from the land go to the landowners. So they're renters, but they're paying in the form of the crops that the peasants are actually growing, but are going to the wealthy landowners. This has the effect then of sort of undermining the whole point of the system, where there's just a few families who own all the land and everybody else is working it for them. Now, in terms of their economy, arts and crafts were a very big part of it, largely because of export, because of their key location. They're able to trade with all sorts of people. An interesting story, though, is the Byzantines were the only people outside of China who knew how to make silk. And there's a story, a sort of legendary story about a monk who traveled along the Silk Road smuggling silkworms out of China. um, we're not exactly sure how it happened, but they did figure out how to make silk, but they had a monopoly on it. They meaning the royal family. Nonetheless, that sort of emphasizes how trade and export was at the basis of their economy. Actually growing food, the agricultural basis, was not actually meeting the demand. Their population being so urban and so large, so many people living in cities, there just weren't that many farmers and they weren't producing enough food. So this is going to create a problem there. This is an image that was made by an Italian. I believe he was from Florence. I'm not exactly sure. Obviously, this is not to scale, but this is sort of like his representation of the city of Constantinople. And a couple of things I want you to notice. First, notice that the whole city is surrounded by a wall, even as it's right up against the shoreline. But there's a couple of things I want to point out here. First, this is the hippodrome. These two giant columns right in the center, and the chariot teams would race in a giant oval here. Right next to that in this image, although it wasn't really next to it, is the Hagia Sophia. But again, the idea is it's so urbanized that there's so many people living in cities that the food situation is not enough to support it. So they've got all sorts of problems with the West as well, and we'll get more into this in tomorrow's lessons. First of all, as we'll see in the Germanic territories of what had been the Western Empire, there are two different attempts to create what they call a Holy Roman Empire. This has a political consequence because, as far as the Byzantines are concerned, they are the Roman Empire. And so there's like that tension that's created there as well. There's religious tensions in what, now remember, it's just a Christian church at this point. However, there's a growing divergence because one half of the empire is still focused on what's going on in Rome, but the other half, what had been the empire, is focused on what's going on in Constantinople. And over time, the way they practice their religions and the things they claim they believe start to diverge in greater and greater degrees, until eventually we reach a point where it splits. This is known as the Great Schism, schism meaning a split. And it starts with mutual excommunications. The Bishop of Constantinople excommunicates the Bishop of Rome, who is the Pope, and vice versa. Now, why is this a big deal? Well, you need to understand this about excommunications. Christians at the time believed that in order to go to heaven, you had to have both, you had to perform the sacramental rituals, including communion and things like that. You had to be baptized, and last rites, the rituals right, before or shortly after you die. Well, in order to do those things, you have to have a priest. If you are excommunicated, you are expelled from the community of Christians. Priests can no longer perform those rituals. So the reason excommunication is a big deal is because it literally condemns your soul to hell from their perspective. So you can see why that's a big problem. If the two most powerful bishops in all of Christendom have excommunicated the other one, this is going to lead to some problems. Eventually, it's going to get so problematic that two new Christian churches are formed. In the eastern part, it's known as Orthodoxy, which is a Greek word that means original, and in the west, it becomes Catholicism, which means universal or everywhere from their perspective. But this is the first time we see a split, an official split to create two new Christian churches. In this particular chart, you can see some of the differences in certain areas between Orthodoxy and Catholicism. The ones I want you to focus on right now have to do first with church leadership. The patriarch is known as the leader of the Orthodox Church. He is the Bishop of Constantinople. And then there's a bunch of other bishops for the cities that are also inside the empire. And the Bishop of Constantinople, the patriarch, is sort of in charge of the other bishops. But it's a much more decentralized system than what happens in the western part under Catholicism. The Pope is the Bishop of Rome, but he is the top of a very elaborate hierarchy we'll look at much more closely in tomorrow's lesson. But in terms of the source of their authority, this is the biggest and perhaps, oh, by the way, patriarch and pope are both variations on the word father, which I find kind of interesting. But the source of authority is the big thing that you need to get here. Because in the Orthodox Church, they practice what is called Caesaropapism, which if you look at the word, it kind of is Caesar over Pope or Patriarch, Father. What does that mean? Well, what that means is the emperor, the Byzantine emperor, actually appoints the Bishop of Constantinople. The patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church, in essence, works for the emperor. Now, by and large, most emperors did not actually get themselves involved too much in church issues. But if the patriarch is in any way doing anything that the emperor doesn't like, he can ultimately remove that patriarch and install another one who he thinks is going to do what he wants. So in the end, the emperor has greater power than the patriarch. In Catholicism, on the other hand, they can't claim papal authority because they are elected by cardinals. We'll get into that more again tomorrow, but they claim they have authority over the kings. In other words, if you look at the hierarchy in the Western tradition, the Pope is above all of the political leaders, whereas in the Orthodox tradition, the emperor is above the most powerful church leaders. Again, there are other issues that we'll look at more closely over time. Those are the big ones right now. So here's the situation. That split is sort of indicative of some challenges that Byzantium's got. From within, the theme system is really starting to erode the power of the state, particularly because you get these generals and many of the wealthy landowners are becoming so powerful that they are a threat to the power of the emperor. Then from the east, you've got these Muslim sultans, the Seljuk Turks, who you will remember, like they will eventually conquer Baghdad and declare themselves a sultanate. They leave the caliph in Baghdad still in charge of the church, but they form their own empire as a sultanate, and are taking so much land away from Byzantium that Byzantium, which had already shrunk pretty significantly, is shrinking even more. Significantly, they also take what the Christians call the Holy Lands, including Jerusalem. Why is that a big deal? Well, because that then becomes the basis for the Crusades. The Western Christians going on these crusades to take back the Holy Lands from these Muslims. And initially, and we'll talk much more about this tomorrow as well. Initially, that was the justification, but over time, the Crusaders actually start attacking Constantinople. Even though they're Christian, their version of Christianity is seen as foreign enough that the Crusaders actually sack the city of Rome itself. Finally, in the end, Constantinople hangs on for a long time. They've got this interesting technology called Greek fire we'll look at later on. They're able to hold the city, the capital city, for a long, long period of time, even though it's constantly under siege. But eventually it's going to fall when another group of Turks that we'll talk about later on, they start at the very end of the post-classical period, called the Ottoman Turks, will eventually conquer the city, and that's the official end of the Byzantine Empire. The city of Constantinople is then renamed as Istanbul, which it still is to this day. So the title of the city, the name of the city, actually can kind of tell you the story from Byzantium to Constantinople to Istanbul, and yet it's all the same place. So if you look at this particular map, what you see is how the Byzantine Empire is just sort of sandwiched in between, even as they have their own internal problems. They've got the Muslims and the Seljuk Turks coming at them from the east. They've got the Crusades, which again, originally were supposed to just take back the Holy Land in the Levant, going right through their territory, but then eventually turning on Constantinople itself. So they're pressured on all sides and will eventually buckle under that pressure, despite like holding out for hundreds of years, despite all of those tensions. I want to thank you for paying attention. Hope you're able to annotate the focus questions. Those will be useful for your focus questions. Thanks again, and we'll see you in class.